Hi friends, Mrs. Rose back again with some more of Charlotte's Web. If I look a little funny, I'm just going to remind you it was Crazy Hat Day today at Daisy, and I decided I'd wear my pink flamingo, and I enjoyed so many crazy hats when I saw you in your meetings virtually at school today. Remember, the chapter coming up is called An Explosion. Day after day, the spider waited, head down, for an idea to come to her. Remember, she was going to save Wilbur? Hour by hour, she sat motionless, deep in thought. Having promised Wilbur that she would save his life, she was determined to keep her promise. A good spider always keeps her promise. Charlotte was naturally patient. She knew from experience that if she waited long enough, a fly would come to her web, and she felt sure if she thought long enough about Wilbur's problem, an idea would come to her mind. Finally, one morning toward the middle of July, the idea came. Why, how perfectly simple, she said to herself. The way to save Wilbur's life is to play a trick on Zuckerman. If I can fool a bug, thought Charlotte, I can surely fool a man. People are not as smart as bugs. Wilbur walked into his yard just at that moment. So here comes Wilbur walking into the yard. What are you thinking about, Charlotte? He asked. I was just thinking, said the spider, that people are very gullible. What does gullible mean? Gullible. Easy to fool, said Charlotte. That's a mercy, replied Wilbur, and he lay down in the shade of his fence and went fast asleep. The spider, however, stayed wide awake, gazing affectionately at him and making plans for his future. Summer was half gone. She knew she didn't have much time. That morning, as Wilbur fell asleep, Avery, Arable, wandered into the Zuckerman's front yard, followed by Fern. Avery carried a live frog in his hand. Fern had a crown of daisies in her hair. The children ran for the kitchen. Just in time for a piece of blueberry pie, said Mrs. Zuckerman. Look at my frog, said Avery, placing the frog on the drain board and holding out his hand for pie. Take that thing out of here, said Mrs. Zuckerman. He's hot, said Fern. He's almost dead, that frog. He is not, said Avery. He lets me scratch him between the eyes. The frog jumped and landed in Mrs. Zuckerman's dishpan full of soapy water. You're getting your pie on you, said Fern. Can I look for eggs in the hen house, Aunt Edith? Run outdoors, both of you, and don't bother the hens. It's getting all over everything, shouted Fern. His pie is all over his front. He's making a mess. Come on, frog, said Avery. He scooped up his frog. The frog kicked, splashing soapy water onto the blueberry pie. Another crisis, groaned Fern. Let's swing in the swing, said Avery. The children ran to the barn. Mr. Zuckerman had the best swing in the county. It was a long piece of heavy rope tied to a beam on the north end of the doorway. At the bottom end of the rope was a fat knot to sit on. It was arranged so that you could swing without being pushed. You climbed a ladder to the hayloft, then holding the rope, you stood at the edge and looked down, and you might have felt scared and dizzy. Then you straddled the knot so that it acted as a seat. Then, when you got up all your nerve, you took a deep breath and jumped. For a second, you seemed to be falling to the barn floor below, but then suddenly the rope would catch you, and you would sail through the barn door, going a mile a minute, and the wind would be whistling in your eyes and your ears and your hair. Then you would zoom upward into the sky and look up at the clouds, and the rope would twist, and you would twist and turn with the rope. Then you would drop down, down, down out of the sky and come sailing back into the barn, almost into the hayloft, then sail out again, but not as quite as far this time, then in again, not quite so high, then out again, then in again, then out, then in, and then you jump off and fall down and let somebody else try it. At least That's what Fern and Avery did. Mothers for miles around wondered about Zuckerman's swing, and they certainly worried about it. They feared some child would fall off, but no child ever did. Children almost always hang on to things tighter than their parents think they will. Avery put the frog in his pocket and climbed to the hayloft. "The last time I swung in this swing, I almost crashed into a barn swallow," he yelled. "Take that frog out," yelled Fern. Avery straddled the rope and jumped. He sailed out through the door, frog and all, and into the sky, frog and all. Then he sailed back into the barn. "Your tongue is purple," screamed Fern. "So is yours," cried Avery, sailing out again with the frog. "I have hay inside my dress. It itches," said Fern. "Scratch it," yelled Avery as he sailed back. "It's my turn," said Fern. "Jump off." "Fern's got the itch," sang Avery. When he jumped off, he threw the swing up to his sister. She shut her eyes tight and jumped. She felt the dizzy drop and then the supporting lift of the swing. When she opened her eyes, she was looking up into the blue sky and was about to fly back towards the door. They took turns for an hour. Let me show you a picture. So here's the swing, and it's right in the barn door. Sounds kind of dangerous. And they're sitting on a knot. Do you see Avery up in the hayloft way up here? And there's Fern on the swing. Sounds like they had a lot of fun, even though all the parents thought it was pretty dangerous. When the children grew tired of swinging, they went down toward the pasture and picked wild raspberries. Their tongues turned from purple to red. Fern bit into a raspberry that had a bad-tasting bug inside it and got discouraged. Avery found an empty candy box and put his frog in it. The frog seemed tired after his morning in the swing. The children walked slowly up toward the barn. They too were tired and hardly had enough energy to walk. "Let's build a tree house," said Avery. "I want to live in a tree with my frog." "I'm going to visit Wilbur," Fern said. They climbed the fence into the lane and walked lazily toward the pig pen. Wilbur heard them coming and got up. Avery noticed the spider web, and coming closer, he saw Charlotte. "Hey, look at that big spider," he said. "It's tremendous." "Leave it alone," commanded Fern. "You've got a frog. Isn't that enough?" "That's a fine spider, and I'm going to capture it," said Avery. He took the cover off his candy box. Then he picked up a stick. "I'm going to knock that old spider into this box," he said. Wilbur's heart almost stopped when he saw what was going on. That might be the end of Charlotte if that naughty boy succeeded in catching her. "You stop it, Avery," said Fern. Avery put one leg out over the fence of the pig pen. He was just about to raise his stick to hit Charlotte when he lost balance. He swayed and toppled and landed on the edge of Wilbur's trough. The trough tipped up and then came down with a slap. The goose egg was right underneath. There was a dull explosion as the egg broke, and then came the most horrible smell. Fern screamed. Avery jumped to his feet. The air was filled with terrible gases and smells from the rotten egg. Templeton, who had been resting in his home, scuttled away into the barn. "Good night, Avery. Good night," screamed Avery. "What a stink. Let's get out of here." Fern was crying. She held her nose and ran toward the house. Avery ran after her, holding his nose. Take a look at what it looks like. Here's Avery, and he had the stick in his hand. He was poking to try and get Charlotte, but fortunately he slipped. But do you see that egg under the trough? And remember the goose said, a rotten egg is a regular stink bomb. So they both holding their noses because it smelled so bad. And Charlotte was feeling greatly relieved to see him go. It had been a narrow escape for her. Later on that morning, the animals came up from the pasture, the sheep, the lambs, the gander, the goose, and the 7 goslings. There were many complaints about that awful smell, and Wilbur had to tell the story over and over again of how the arable boy, that naughty Avery, had tried to capture Charlotte and how the smell of the broken egg drove him away just in time. It was that rotten goose egg that saved Charlotte's life, said Wilbur. The goose was proud of her share in the adventure. I'm delighted that the egg never hatched, she gabbled. Templeton, of course, was miserable over the loss of his beloved egg, but he couldn't resist boasting. It pays to save things, he said in his surly voice. A rat never knows when something's going to come in handy. I never throw anything away. Well, said one of the lambs, this whole business is all well and good for Charlotte, but what about the rest of us? That smell is unbearable. Who wants to live in a barn that is perfumed with rotten egg? Don't worry about it. You'll get used to it, said Templeton. He sat up and pulled wisely on his long whiskers, then crept away to pay a visit to the dump. When Lurvy showed up at lunchtime carrying a pail of food for Wilbur, he stopped short a few paces from the pig pen. He sniffed the air and made a face. What in thunder, he said. Setting the pail down, he picked up the stick that Avery had dropped and pried the trough up. Rats, he said. I knew it must have been a rat would make a nest under this trough. How I hate a rat. And Lurvy dragged Wilbur's trough across the yard and kicked some dirt into the rat's nest, burying the broken egg and all of Templeton's other possessions. Then he picked up the pail. Sorry about that. Mrs. Rose is getting tired. It's very late at night. He picked up the pail. Wilbur stood in the trough, drooling with hunger. Lurvy poured. The slops ran creamily down around the pig's eyes and ears. Wilbur grunted. He gulped and sucked and sucked and gulped, making swishing and swishing noises, anxious to get everything at once. It was a delicious meal. Milk, wheat midlands, leftover pancakes, half a donut, the rind of a summer squash, 2 pieces of stale toast, a third of a ginger snap, a fish tail, 1 orange peel, several noodles from noodle soup, the scum off a cup of cocoa, an ancient jelly roll, a strip of paper from the lining of the garbage pail, and a spoonful of raspberry jello. Sounds like a feast for a pig, like Wilbur. Wilbur ate heartily. He planned to leave half a noodle and a few drops of milk for Templeton. Then he remembered that the rat had been useful in saving Charlotte's life and that Charlotte was trying to save his life, so he left a whole noodle instead of a half. Now that the broken egg was buried, the air cleared and the barn smelled pretty good again. The afternoon passed and evening came. Shadows lengthened. The cool and kindly breath of evening entered through the doors and windows. Astride her web, Charlotte sat moodily, eating a horsefly and thinking about the future. After a while, she bestirred herself. She descended to the center of the web, and there she began to cut some of her lines. She worked slowly but steadily while the other creatures drowsed. None of the others, not even the goose, noticed that she was at work. Deep in his soft bed, Wilbur snoozed. Over in his favorite corner, the goslings whistled a goodnight song. Charlotte tore quite a section out of her web, leaving an open space in the middle. Then she started weaving something to take the place of the threads she had removed. When Templeton got back from the dump around midnight, the spider was still at work. Wonder what she's up to. That is the end of chapter 10. The spider was still at work after midnight, and when we come back next time, it'll be chapter 11, and it's called The Miracle. So let's find out what the miracle is. And remember, Charlotte's working very hard to save her friend Wilbur. What a nice friend, and what good friends they are. I hope you enjoyed. I'll probably take my pink flamingo off. Maybe I'll have something different on next time I see you. And hope you enjoyed the story, and hope you have a good night. Good night from Mrs. Rose.